The thunder rattled my windows as I pressed play on the leak, and Lily Hart appeared on a stage built from my late nights. She smiled into flashbulbs and said, "Innovation demands courage," while the halopath schematic glowed behind her. My watermark was sliced away like a scar someone refused to face. She said, "Ethan botched security, but we rebuilt from ashes," and the room erupted in praise. I tasted metal and counted the lies like they were beads on a wire. Zoe called and said, "Maya, the clip is everywhere. Breathe and look closer." The camera drifted to Conrad near the stage, a granite shadow guarding a theft. I whispered, "She took my code, my pitch, even my story, and she wears it like perfume." The applause swelled until it sounded like machinery grinding bone. I closed the laptop and said, "Enough. She stole my life, and I am taking it back." I met Zoe at the all-night diner where the coffee tastes like defiance and old coins. She said, "You warned me, and I did not listen. I am sorry," and pushed a napkin full of names across the table. I traced the ink trails like fault lines on a map. "I knew it," she said. "Conrad scrubs their mess before sunrise, so we need something louder than rumor." The rain drummed tempo on the neon sign, and my pulse matched it. I said, "They cut Ethan to build the lie, and now they wear my work like armor." The waitress slid a mug and did not ask questions because the night already had too many. Zoe said, "Daniel still owes you. He will pick up on the first ring." I watched the door and imagined Lily's grin evaporate under daylight. I said, "We start with proof, then we tear their story down to the nails." The lobby guard buzzed me in because muscle memory outlived HR memos. I kept my head down and said, "Just grabbing a personal drive," while Conrad's reflection sharpened in the glass. He said, "You do not work here," and the words landed like bolts. I said, "You do not build here either. You mop blood from the gears." His jaw ticked a half beat, then the elevator chimed like a verdict. "I moved first because fear is slow and I cannot afford it anymore." He said, "Walk away before you break something you cannot fix." My pulse thudded against the badge still clipped inside my bag like a ghost. I said, "Something already broke, and it has my name on it." The doors closed and my mirror stared back like a stranger who would not blink. Daniel answered before the second ring, and the hum of his gym bled through the line. He said, "If you chase with rage, it will eat the part you are trying to save." I said, "She burned my name and fed the smoke to a crowd, and I am done being polite." He met me among heavy bags that swayed like tired planets. He said, "You want revenge, then you want discipline even more." I said, "I want truth so sharp it cuts through PR armor." He taped my wrists and said, "Then document everything, and let them run onto your blade." The bag kissed my knuckles, and I remembered how to breathe. He said, "When you hit, you tell a story they cannot rewrite." I nodded, because the sound of leather was a promise I could keep. Dawn peeled over the city, like a pale receipt that proves what was spent. My apartment floor became a battlefield of screenshots, contracts, and dates. I said, "She thinks erasing metadata erases me," and pinned a printout with a red thread. Zoe texted, "I found an old backup from your beta night in March." I said, "Good, that is the night her story starts limping." The kettle clicked off, and the silence felt clean for once. I rehearsed the pitch I would give to the truth itself. I said, "Ethan deserves his name back, and I want mine without smoke." On the wall, Lily's smile sat between two invoices like a crown ready to crumble. I said, "Act 1 ends here, and I choose the next page." The morning after felt like ash in my throat. Ethan sat across from me in the park, his hoodie damp with dew, his hands clutching a folder as if it might dissolve. He said, "They made me their scapegoat, Maya, and I let them." I said, "You did not. They carved their path on your silence." His laugh was hollow, and the pigeons fled as if they knew shame has weight. He flipped a page showing doctored timestamps, red circles clawed across his notes. I said, "This is how they bury us, but now we dig." His eyes softened a fraction, and he whispered, "I do not know if I have the strength." I reached across the splintered bench and gripped his wrist. I said, then use mine, until yours returns. Zoe spread printouts across her kitchen counter like tarot cards predicting ruin. She said, Conrad cleans trails but not memories, and mine is stubborn. I leaned over and traced the invoices that pointed toward Lily's offshore accounts. She said, she always needed a stage, but not a ledger. I said, then let us drag her spotlight to the ledger. The kettle hissed, and steam clouded the fluorescent hum of her tiny flat. She said, proof is not enough, you need an audience. I said, every empire rots under the weight of receipts. Might? She smirked with weary pride, and for one fragile second, I remembered friendship before fire. I walked past the office tower at noon, the glass gleaming like sharpened teeth. Lily's face dominated the lobby screen, frozen in a smile that belonged to thieves. A passerby said, that woman is brilliant. And I bit my tongue before spitting the truth. My reflection blurred against hers, predator and prey, in the same pain. I whispered, you built a stage on my bones, and I will dismantle it beam by beam. Inside I saw Conrad by security, his shadow wider than the pillars. He scanned the crowd, unbothered, because he thought ghosts do not haunt in daylight. I stepped back, pressed my palm to the cold glass, and vowed, you will learn ghosts can burn. Daniel poured black coffee into a chipped mug, his gym now sunlit but no softer. He said, revenge without clarity is just self-harm dressed up in armor. I said, then guide me until the blade points true. He set an old folder on the bench, scars of his own past, bleeding through yellowed pages. He said, I once stood where you stand, chasing shadows with fire. I lost more than I gained. I said, I am not afraid to lose. I am afraid to remain erased. He nodded once, slow, like a verdict carried by wind. He said, then fight, but remember, when the mask drops, make sure it is not your own face beneath it. That night, the city roared with indifferent traffic, as Zoe, Ethan, and I gathered in my apartment. The board on the wall was now a battlefield of threads and notes. Ethan said, what if they destroy us again? Zoe said, then at least the world will know what they destroyed. I said, she stole my story, and in taking it back, we write theirs in fire. Kettles steamed again, our anthem of war, and silence draped over us like armor. Ethan's hands shook as he pinned a new invoice to the map. I placed my hand over his and said, not ghosts anymore, soldiers. The room smelled of paper and burnt resolve, and for the first time, I felt the storm obey. The library's back room smelled of dust and forgotten rebellions. Zoe said, you asked for proof, so here's where paper outlives firewalls. She slid a folder across, its spine broken by years of hiding. Ethan traced the edges as if paper might cut him free. I said, this isn't a leak, this is a ledger. The yellow light hummed above, trembling like a secret trying to hold. Zoe whispered, her offshore trail runs deeper than anyone guessed, but no bank hides forever. Ethan said, if we expose this, we'll drag Conrad too. I said, then let him drown with her lies. My reflection in the dusty window almost smiled, but not kindly. Daniel leaned against the heavy bag, arms crossed, watching me pace. He said, strategy before swing, or you'll hit air. I said, she lives on applause, so we need to turn the lights off mid-show. His eyes narrowed, and he dropped a folder of court contacts on the bench. He said, allies aren't trophies, they're shields. Choose carefully. I said, then we start with the lawyer who owes you. He grunted, a sound halfway between warning and approval. The bag swung slowly, as if remembering every fist it had eaten. I stopped pacing and said, this isn't just payback, it's trial by daylight. We met the lawyer, Margaret Kane, in a smoky cafe where secrets smelled like bitter espresso. She said, Daniel vouched for you, so speak fast. Zoe nudged me, and I laid the folder open, pages bleeding with proof. Margaret scanned, her jaw tightening with each line. Ethan whispered, if this fails, we burn twice. Margaret looked up and said, if this holds, You're about to burn her empire instead. I said, then let it catch because silence already cost too much. She tapped the folder once like a gavel and said, You'll need timing sharper than this coffee. My chest tightened, but hope scratched at the edges. Outside the cafe, Conrad's SUV idled like a black predator waiting for pulse. Zoe hissed, He's watching. Conrad leaned in the driver's seat, phone pressed against his jaw. Ethan froze, fear crawling up his neck. I said, Let him watch, it means he's afraid. Conrad glanced up, eyes cold, then smirked as if already winning. My fingers itched to shatter his window, but Daniel's voice rang in my head, Discipline first. I said, We're ghosts until we're fire. Zoe tugged my sleeve, dragging me into shadow. The SUV's headlights cut through drizzle, scanning the street like searchlights on prey. Back at my apartment, the evidence wall stretched wider, threads weaving a noose around Lily's empire. Ethan pinned new dates. Zoe cross-checked transfers. Margaret's notes scribbled across margins. I said, This is no longer just theft. This is empire fraud. Zoe said, And fraud this big doesn't collapse quietly. Ethan's voice cracked. If they silence us first, I said, then our silence will already have spoken in files we've scattered. The kettle hissed again, steam clouding my window, city lights bleeding through. I whispered, We've moved from prey to predators, and they don't even see the teeth yet. The rain hammered on the courthouse roof as we pushed through the rusted door to the archive, the air thick with dust and paper that hadn't been touched in decades. Margaret said, Corruption hides in daylight, but its footprints are always in the dark. Zoe's flashlight beam jittered across rows of swollen files, shadows stretching like bars across our path. Ethan's whisper cracked, If Conrad has been here before, we're chasing ghosts. I forced my hand to stay steady as I pulled folders loose, pages brittle and sharp. I said, Then let us chase his ghosts until they scream. Margaret lifted a folder marked with Lily's Shell Company, and her jaw locked like steel. She said, Here's the rope she tied herself with. Thunder cracked above, making the glass rattle as if the courthouse itself begged to speak. I whispered, Then tonight, the storm belongs to us. Outside, the storm hissed against the pavement as headlights cut through fog. Conrad leaned against his black SUV, like a wolf at the edge of firelight, cigarette burning between his fingers. He said, Little mice love old corners. Smoke coiled upward, glowing red at the tip, his smirk colder than the rain. Zoe hissed, Do not bite, he wants a show. Margaret's voice was iron. Let him talk, not touch. Ethan's hands jammed into his hoodie, his voice shaking. He knows what we took. Conrad flicked ash, laughing low. I know every move Lily owns, and she owns your silence now. I stepped closer, the rain soaking through my coat, my voice steady. Silence never belonged to me, and neither does fear. His grin widened like a blade. He tossed the cigarette into the gutter and slid into the SUV. Tires hissed against wet asphalt, leaving only the stink of smoke and threat. Back at Daniel's gym, the night clung to us like a second skin, rain dripping from coats onto the mats. Daniel stood unmoving, arms crossed, eyes cutting through us like glass. He said, Conrad won't stalk forever. Sooner or later he'll strike. Margaret spread papers across the bench like a general laying out war maps, her finger jabbing at account trails. Zoe muttered, These link Lily's empire to the offshore shells. Ethan's breath trembled as he added a note in messy handwriting, his voice raw. And to me, to my collapse. I planted both palms on the table, the papers damp beneath them. I said, Then we use their greed to end them. Daniel's voice was low and deliberate. When you choose war, you carry its cost on your back forever. I met his gaze and said, The cost is already tattooed into me. The heavy bag swayed above us, chains creaking like gallows in a wind only we could hear. At dawn the gala glittered like a cathedral to false gods. Golden chandeliers spilled light across velvet curtains, and Lily stood radiant, soaking in devotion. She said, "Every success is resilience in motion," her words rolling like a hymn. I watched from the back, blood pounding against my ribs. Zoe leaned close and hissed, "She wears your scars as ornaments." Ethan's voice was hollow, "And they bow to her." Margaret crossed her arms and whispered, "Let them cheer. Tomorrow the mask drops." I said, "She thinks applause is armor, but truth is fire, and it burns cleaner." Cameras flashed in bursts like lightning, the crowd roaring. Conrad stood near the side wall, his eyes scanning, a predator guarding his queen. For once I stared back, daring him to see me, and his gaze held mine until the lights dimmed. That night my apartment no longer looked like a home. It looked like a war room. The evidence wall glowed under lamplight, red strings stretching like veins across faces and dates. Zoe leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, her voice hard. "Once this goes out, there's no undo." Ethan pressed his forehead against his hand, whispering, "If it fails, they'll erase us again, deeper this time." Margaret lit a cigarette by the open window, the smoke curling like ink into night. She said, "Failure is their language. Truth is yours. Speak it loud enough, and it cannot be unheard." Daniel stood near the door, silent, but his gaze was an anchor in the storm. I touched Lily's smiling photo at the center of the board, strings branching from it like a web choking itself. I whispered, "War isn't coming anymore. It's here, and I choose it." The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the city holding its breath. Morning light knifed through courthouse glass as Margaret set our motion on the table. She said, "We ask for an emergency hold and preservation of systems." The judge watched without blinking, as if weighing thunder. Zoe whispered, "If we win, her rollout freezes." Ethan said, "If we lose, she buries us deeper." Lily sat 2 rows back, face calm, a smile trained for cameras. Conrad leaned by counsel like a storm in a suit. I said, "We are not here to win applause. We are here to cage the truth." Margaret said, "Your Honor, timestamps were altered to erase authorship." The judge signed, pen scraping like a match across grit. He said, 72 hours. Preserve all assets, no deletions." On the courthouse steps, microphones bloomed like metal flowers, thirsty for heat. Lily said, "We welcome scrutiny because integrity built this company." Her smile never touched her eyes. Conrad hovered near the curb, counting cameras. Margaret murmured, "She is planting headlines before facts can root." Zoe said, "Then we water facts in public." I lifted a tablet and mirrored our side-by-side slides. I said, "This is the blueprint with my original watermark ghosting beneath the crop." Ethan whispered, "And this is the commit trail that survived her edits." Reporters inhaled as if oxygen had been upgraded. The first question hit like a timed charge. By afternoon, Zoe cracked the backup from the beta night, a zip sealed with old pride. She said, "The audio survived, buried under renamed logs." A waveform pulsed on her screen like a heart refusing to quit. Lily's voice slid out, smooth as a scalpel. "Crop her mark, then pin security on Ethan." Conrad said, "I will handle the chatter." Silence landed heavy, then Ethan pressed knuckles to his mouth. He said, "They rehearsed my fall like theater." I said, "And we just found their script." Margaret said, "Chain of custody is clean enough to draw blood." The city horn outside sounded like a verdict clearing its throat. Night folded over the storage yards, where secrets rust under sodium lamps. Daniel said before I walked away, "I trained security contractors including Conrad." The confession hit colder than the wind. He said, "He keeps a dead drop server he calls the cold mirror." Zoe said, "A local cache of comets he thinks are invisible." Ethan added, "Then the original timestamps live here." I said, "We do not take it, we witness it." Daniel passed me bolt cutters, and then paused, regret flickering. He said, "I brought a key instead. I am done breaking the wrong doors." The unit rolled up with a rattle that sounded like a curtain, refusing its last act. Inside the unit, a humming rack blinked like a city of tiny lies. Margaret said, "Record, inventory, and do not touch." The screen mirrored a repository frozen in time, names stamped like fossils. Zoe said there, the commit with Maya's author tag, backdated by forgery upstream. Daniel stared at a laminated page pinned to a clipboard. He said, "That notary seal is mine." The words punched the air. He said, "Years ago, Lily borrowed my seal for a favor, and I did not see the knife in her hand." I said, "She forged the backdating with your stamp." Ethan whispered, "That is her darkest mask." Margaret lifted the clipboard like a verdict. She said, "This is the nail that closes her coffin." The clerk rolled in a cart of exhibits, while the gallery hummed like a hive. Margaret said, "We submit the cold mirror index and the notarized chain." The judge leaned forward as the audio filled the room like a slow knife. Lily did not flinch, but her smile trembled at the edges like wet paper. Conrad stood behind her, stone-faced, eyes counting exits, not truths. Zoe said, "Playback from the beta night, uncompressed, original hash intact." Ethan stared at the table and whispered, "This is where they scripted me." I said, "This is where we end the script and start the record." The gavel tapped once, and the clerk stamped the seal like thunder restrained. The judge said, "Proceed to forensic copy now with officers present." In the marble corridor, the world sounded far away, like rain behind thick glass. Lily said, "You finally learned to curate your tragedy." I said, "You finally learned to choke on yours." She stepped closer, perfume sharp as an alibi. Conrad moved to block the camera. Shoulders squared, voice low, "Walk." I held up the clipboard copy. I said, "Your empire runs on a stolen seal and a spliced voice." Lily smiled thinly and said, "Audience is everything. And mine still believes." I said, "Then watch them learn." Her eyes flashed a crack in porcelain. Conrad's phone buzzed, and for once he looked unsure. The corridor lights hummed like verdicts about to speak. Night returned us to the storage yards, where steel doors held their breath. Engines murmured in the distance like wolves pacing fences. Conrad stepped from the dark, rain stippling his shoulders. He said, "Turn around, or I turn this to ash." Daniel moved beside me, voice steady and sad. "You still hit first like I taught you." Conrad's jaw tightened at the memory. I said, "The server stays, and so do we." Zoe raised her camera, and Ethan lifted the inventory log. Daniel said, "You know Lily keeps an exit hatch with your name on it." The words landed heavy. Conrad lowered his gaze, then holstered the threat in silence. We walked past, and the night finally exhaled. We took a borrowed studio and turned it into a gallows for lies. Zoe aligned the slides, Margaret checked captions for teeth, and Ethan steadied the audio. I said, "We stream, we mirror, and we cede to every outlet." Margaret said, "Facts first, anger second, then let the crowd burn clean." The live indicator flared red like a fuse. I spoke to the lens, voice even, and cut to bone. I said, "Here is the ledger. Here is the seal. Here is the voice giving orders." Comments poured like hail, punching dents into the myth. On a muted screen, Lily's PR broadcast tried to hold, and then it buckled. Before dawn, the rooftop felt like the world's last unwritten line. Sirens stitched the streets below while the wind tore at the edges of my coat. Lily stood by the helipad lights, brighter than she was brave. She said, "Say we built it together, and I keep you in the credits." I said, "You erased me," and the backup refused to forget. Her eyes wet with fury. She spat, "You will be nothing without this fight." I said, "Then I will be nothing, and honest." Conrad appeared in the doorway, face gray with sleepless doubt. He said nothing, which said everything. The first helicopter circled, and the night finally let go. By sunrise, warrants moved like weather across Lily's empire, and sirens stitched the streets. Margaret said, "Preserve, mirror, and lock." Technicians rolled cases past us, quiet as surgeons. Zoe said, the stream is trending, and the comments cut clean. Ethan read the court email twice. He said, they cleared my name. Daniel stood at the curb, rain drying into salt. He said, hold your center, the storm has aftershocks. Conrad walked up alone and handed a key to an officer. He said nothing, and that said everything. Lily arrived late, glasses on, chin high, smile empty. I said, history is not a prop. It keeps receipts. In the hearing room, the air felt varnished with old power and new fear. The auditor said, we've verified the cold mirror and the forged seal. Lily did not blink. She said, competitors staged this. Margaret slid forward a chain of custody like a spine. She said, the facts walk by themselves. Conrad stared at the table, hands flat, voice drained. He said, I enabled the cache, and I regret it. Ethan whispered, that is the first honest thing he has said. Zoe's recorder blinked red. I said, you stole my work, my name, and my future. I am taking them back. The gavel fell once and sounded like a door closing. We met in a quiet green room that smelled like dust and expensive apologies. Lily said, you could have shared the stage. I said, you sold my name and called it partnership. She paced, heels biting the carpet like small arguments. She said, you had their love, I had their respect, and respect gets bored. I said, you were my friend before you were my rival. Her face faltered, then smoothed like glass over fire. She said, I learned the world crowns thieves who smile during the oath. I said, then stop smiling. She looked at the door as if it might rewrite the day. She said, tell them I built it with you. I said, tell them you didn't. That night we posted the full repository and the audit clean as bone. Zoe said, the mirror links are mirrored again, they cannot kill them all. Ethan uploaded his letter of exoneration, hands steady for the first time. He said, I kept my notes because I thought I was the villain. Daniel leaned against the window and watched the city breathe. He said, you fought like a builder, not a brawler. Margaret drafted settlement terms with a scalpel's care. She said, restitution, attribution, board resignations. I said, and a public apology that names the theft. The page refreshed, and the signatures began to gather like rain. Morning found the diner again, where victories taste like coffee and consequence. Zoe slid a headline across the table like a medal that still burns. She said, she resigned, and the board named you as original author. Ethan set down 2 mugs with an unshaking hand. He said to the record, finally sober. Daniel nodded once, the kind of approval that does not need sound. Margaret said, the apology goes live at noon. The door chimed, and Conrad paused on the threshold. He said, I will testify, and I will live with it. He left before we could answer. I looked at the empty booth where friendship once sat and said, I take my life back. The coffee steamed, and the city listened.